Picture this, it's 1750. A man breaks into your home in the dead of night, steals your valuables, and vanishes into the wilderness. There's no 911 to call, no detectives to dust for fingerprints, no police department to file a report with. In fact, the very concept of a police officer doesn't exist yet. So what do you do? In colonial America, if you wanted justice, you had to go get it yourself. You'd gather your neighbors, grab your muskets, and hunt the criminal down through forests and swamps. You offer rewards from your own pocket to anyone who could bring the thief back, dead or alive. You'd rely on a system so raw and improvised that the line between lawman and vigilante was almost invisible. This is the untold story of how an entire society dealt with crime before modern law enforcement existed, before police academies, before forensic science, before Miranda rights. It's a tale of ordinary citizens turned manhunters, of legal doctrines born from desperation, and of a justice system that was equal parts ingenious and terrifying. Welcome to colonial crime fighting, where everyone was both protector and potential prosecutor. Historical context and background. To understand crime and punishment in colonial America, we must first grasp the world these colonists inhabited. Between roughly 1607 and 1776, European settlers established communities along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States. These weren't neat, organized societies with bureaucratic infrastructure. They were frontier settlements carved out of wilderness, constantly threatened by harsh weather, disease, conflicts with Native Americans, and the ever-present challenge of simple survival. The colonists brought English common law traditions with them across the Atlantic, but they couldn't replicate England's increasingly sophisticated legal machinery. In England, the Bow Street runners, often considered the precursors to modern police, wouldn't be established until 1749, and even they were more like private investigators than police officers. The London Metropolitan Police, the first recognizable modern police force, wasn't created until 1829, well after American independence. This means that throughout the entire colonial period, neither the colonies nor their mother country had anything resembling professional law enforcement as we understand it today. Colonial governance was deliberately decentralized. The British Crown appointed royal governors, but actual administration happened at the local level through town meetings in New England and county courts in the South. Each colony developed its own legal codes, often adapting English law to frontier conditions. Massachusetts had its Body of Liberties, 1641, while Virginia relied heavily on county courts and parish vestries for local governance. The population was overwhelmingly rural and dispersed. In 1700, only about 10% of colonists lived in towns. The rest were scattered across farms and small settlements connected by rough roads or waterways. Boston, the largest city, had only about 7,000 residents in 1700. This geographic reality made centralized law enforcement logistically impossible. Even if colonists had wanted to create police forces, they simply didn't have the population density, tax base, or infrastructure to support them. Crime in colonial America took forms both familiar and foreign to modern eyes. Property crimes, theft, burglary, livestock rustling, were constant problems in cash-poor societies where a stolen horse or cow could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Violent crimes occurred but were relatively rare compared to today, partly because small communities had strong social controls where everyone knew everyone else's business. Public drunkenness and Sabbath breaking were treated as criminal offenses, reflecting the colony's religious character. Piracy plagued coastal areas, with figures like Blackbeard terrorizing shipping lanes. The legal positions that did exist were fundamentally different from modern law enforcement. The office of sheriff, imported from England, was the primary law enforcement position, but colonial sheriffs were vastly different from their modern namesakes. Sheriffs were appointed or elected locally, served as officers of the court rather than crime fighters, and spent most of their time serving legal papers, collecting taxes and managing jails, not investigating crimes or patrolling streets. They received fees for specific services rather than salaries, creating perverse incentives where profit often trumped justice. Constables operated at an even more local level, appointed in towns and parishes for one-year terms. These positions were often seen as civic burdens rather than careers. Citizens took turns serving as constable, much like jury duty today. Constables had minimal training, minimal authority, and minimal interest in the job. Their primary duty was maintaining order during town meetings and church services, not solving crimes. The night watch system, borrowed from English cities, appeared in larger colonial towns. Boston established its night watch in 1631, New York in 1658. These were groups of citizens who took turns patrolling streets after dark, calling out the hours and watching for fires, not crimes. Watch duty was mandatory, unpaid, and deeply unpopular. Wealthier citizens often paid poor men to serve in their place, meaning the watch was staffed by the least motivated and least capable citizens. This was the reality. Colonial America had legal officials but no law enforcement profession. They had courts but no investigators. They had laws but no systematic means of enforcing them. Into this vacuum stepped something far older and more primal than professional policing: community self-defense, formalized through legal doctrines that made every citizen potentially responsible for catching criminals. The posse comitatus was born not from choice but from absolute necessity. Case studies/real-life examples. Case Study 1. The posse comitatus system in action. The pursuit of Tom Bell's gang, Pennsylvania, 1750. The posse comitatus, Latin for power of the county, was the legal backbone of criminal apprehension in colonial America. This ancient English doctrine gave sheriffs the authority to summon all able-bodied men over 15 to assist in pursuing criminals. Refusal to join a legally summoned posse was itself a crime, punishable by fines or imprisonment. This wasn't optional civic service. It was legal obligation backed by the force of law. Consider a typical case from 1750 Pennsylvania, documented in colonial court records. Thomas Bell, known as Tom Bell, led a gang that had been systematically robbing travelers along the Philadelphia to Lancaster Road, a crucial trade route. After Bell's gang robbed and beat a wealthy merchant named Samuel Preston, leaving him for dead on the roadside, Preston survived and made his way to the nearest town to report the crime. The local sheriff, William Bradford, immediately issued a hue and cry, the legal proclamation that a serious crime had occurred and all citizens must assist. Bradford then exercised his posse comitatus authority, summoning every able-bodied man in 3 townships. Within hours, approximately 60 men had assembled: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, tavern owners, none with any law enforcement training whatsoever. Historical accounts describe the pursuit lasting 5 days. The posse split into smaller groups, each assigned different roads and settlements where the gang might have fled. They relied on tracking skills learned from hunting, on interrogating anyone who might have seen suspicious strangers, and on the knowledge that in small colonial communities, strangers stood out. They operated on their own supplies, brought their own weapons and horses, and received no compensation except the promise of sharing any reward money that might be offered. On the 3rd day, one group spotted members of Bell's gang in a tavern in a small settlement near the Susquehanna River. Rather than attempt an immediate arrest, they sent word to Sheriff Bradford and maintained surveillance. When Bradford arrived with reinforcements, they surrounded the tavern at dawn. Bell and 3 accomplices were captured after a brief struggle in which one posse member was shot and wounded, a reminder that these civilian manhunters faced real danger. Bell and his gang were transported back to Philadelphia, where they faced trial before the colonial court. All were convicted of robbery and assault. Bell was sentenced to hang. His accomplices received severe public whippings and branding on the thumb, a permanent mark identifying them as convicted criminals. The posse members who effected the capture received shares of a £50 reward that Preston had posted, a substantial sum equivalent to nearly a year's wages for a laborer. This case illustrates how the posse system functioned at its best: swift community mobilization, determination and persistence in tracking criminals across rough terrain, and ultimate success in apprehending dangerous offenders. But it also reveals the system's limitations and inherent dangers: armed civilians pursuing dangerous criminals, split-second decisions made without legal training, and violence that could easily escalate beyond control. Case Study 2. The Manhunt for the Murderer of Rebecca Cornell, Rhode Island, 1673. One of the most famous criminal investigations in colonial America demonstrates both the sophistication and superstition that characterized colonial crime solving. In February 1673, Rebecca Cornell, a 73-year-old widow, was found dead in her home in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, her body severely burned. Initially, her death was ruled an accident, the assumption being she had fallen into the fireplace while alone. But Rebecca's brother, John Briggs, wasn't satisfied with this conclusion. In an era before medical examiners or crime scene investigators, Briggs organized what amounted to an unofficial inquiry. He gathered neighbors who had seen Rebecca in the days before her death, documented her injuries more carefully, and noted that burn patterns seemed inconsistent with an accidental fall. Most remarkably, he recorded testimony that Rebecca's ghost had appeared to another brother, claiming she had been murdered. This ghost testimony, which would be inadmissible in any modern court, was taken seriously in Puritan New England, where the supernatural was considered real and potentially evidential. The colonial authorities ordered Rebecca's body exhumed for examination. Local physicians and magistrates conducted what might be considered a crude autopsy, discovering a wound in her abdomen that appeared to have been made before the burning. This finding transformed the case from accident to suspected murder. Suspicion quickly focused on Rebecca's son, Thomas Cornell Jr., with whom she had been living and with whom she'd had contentious relations over property and money. The colonial investigation that followed reveals how colonists approached criminal detection without professional investigators. Magistrates interviewed dozens of witnesses, collecting testimony about family disputes, Thomas's financial troubles, and his whereabouts the night of his mother's death. They examined physical evidence: Rebecca's clothing, the condition of the fireplace, marks on her body. They even conducted an early form of forensic timeline analysis, tracking when various people had last seen Rebecca alive. Pursuit of Thomas Cornell didn't involve a dramatic manhunt. He never fled. But the investigation demonstrates another form of catching criminals in colonial America: the methodical gathering of witness testimony and circumstantial evidence to build a case. Thomas was arrested and held in custody while the investigation proceeded. In May 1673, he was tried before the colonial court in Newport. The trial was a community affair, with townspeople packed into the courtroom. The prosecution presented its evidence: Rebecca's ghost testimony delivered through her brother, the medical examination findings, testimony about family disputes, and witnesses who claimed Thomas had made threatening statements. Thomas maintained his innocence, but the jury convicted him after brief deliberation. He was sentenced to hang. On May 23, 1673, Thomas Cornell was executed in Newport, one of the earliest documented murder convictions in New England. The case became famous throughout the colonies, discussed in sermons and correspondence as an example of divine justice revealing hidden crimes. Modern historians debate whether Thomas was actually guilty. Some suggest the evidence was circumstantial and potentially tainted by family rivalries and supernatural hysteria. But the case undeniably shows how colonial Americans pursued justice in serious crimes. Through community investigation, witness testimony, rudimentary physical evidence examination, and swift, public punishment. Case Study 3. The Bounty Hunters and the Capture of the Pirate Stede Bonnet, Carolina Coast, 1718. Colonial America's bounty system represents a particularly fascinating approach to criminal apprehension, essentially privatizing law enforcement by offering financial rewards for capturing criminals. This system reached its apex in dealing with pirates who plagued colonial shipping during the golden age of piracy, roughly 1650–1730. Stede Bonnet, known as the Gentleman Pirate, was an unlikely criminal, a wealthy Barbadian plantation owner who inexplicably turned to piracy in 1717, possibly to escape a difficult marriage. After a career that included sailing with the notorious Blackbeard, Bonnet operated independently, capturing numerous merchant vessels off the Carolina coast. By 1718, he had become such a threat to Charleston's vital trade that South Carolina Governor Robert Johnson took action. Unable to pursue Bonnet with any official naval force, South Carolina had none. Governor Johnson turned to the bounty system. He issued a proclamation offering substantial rewards for the capture of Bonnet and his crew, £1,000 for Bonnet himself, an enormous fortune, and lesser amounts for his crew members. The proclamation was posted in taverns, churches, and public buildings throughout the colony, and news spread rapidly through the maritime community. The proclamation attracted Colonel William Rhett, a militia officer and ship owner who saw both profit and glory in capturing the pirates. Unlike a posse of farmers pursuing a robber, Rhett organized what amounted to a private naval expedition. He obtained Governor Johnson's authorization to arm 2 sloops, the Henry and the Sea Nymph, with cannons and small arms. He recruited about 130 men, sailors, merchants, and adventurers, with promises of shares in the reward money and any treasure captured. In September 1718, Rhett's expedition discovered Bonnet's ship, the Royal James, anchored in the Cape Fear River in present-day North Carolina. What followed was a 5-hour naval battle on September 27, 1718, documented in colonial records and participants' accounts. Both Bonnet's ship and Rhett's vessels ran aground on shoals, forcing a protracted exchange of cannon and musket fire at close range. The battle was brutal. Nearly a dozen men were killed and many more wounded. When the tide finally rose, Rhett maneuvered his vessels to gain advantage, and Bonnet, seeing the hopelessness of his position, surrendered. Rhett captured Bonnet and his entire crew of 45 pirates, transporting them back to Charleston in chains. The trial was a major colonial event, with crowds gathering to see the captured pirates. Despite Bonnet's gentlemanly background and eloquent pleas for mercy, he was convicted of piracy, a capital offense under British Admiralty law. On December 10, 1718, Stede Bonnet was hanged at White Point in Charleston, along with 29 of his crew members in the largest mass execution in colonial American history. The hangings were public spectacles designed to deter other potential pirates. Colonel Rhett and his men collected their substantial reward money, and Rhett's reputation as a colonial hero was established. This case illustrates how the bounty system could mobilize significant private resources to address major criminal threats. It worked because the reward was substantial enough to offset the considerable risks and costs of pursuing dangerous criminals. But it also reveals the system's potential for violence and exploitation. Rhett was essentially a licensed private warrior, pursuing profit as much as justice. The bounty system blurred the line between law enforcement and mercenary activity, creating incentives that could lead to excessive violence, false accusations, and the capture of innocents who couldn't defend themselves against well-armed bounty hunters. Case Study 4. The Slave Patrols Enforcing Racial Control in the Southern Colonies, Virginia, 1704. No examination of colonial crime fighting would be complete without addressing the darkest aspect of colonial law enforcement: the slave patrols. These organized groups, particularly prominent in southern colonies, represent a unique and deeply troubling form of colonial policing that specifically targeted enslaved African Americans who were deemed criminals simply for seeking freedom. In 1704, Virginia passed comprehensive slave patrol legislation requiring counties to establish regular patrols with legal authority to stop, search, and punish enslaved people found without written passes from their enslavers. These patrols typically consisted of 3 to 6 white men who rode circuits through rural areas, particularly at night, and on weekends when enslaved people might attempt to escape or gather. The crime these patrols pursued was often nothing more than traveling without permission, gathering in groups, or possessing weapons, actions that would be entirely legal for white colonists, but were criminalized for enslaved people. When patrols encountered enslaved people they deemed suspicious, they had legal authority to administer immediate punishment, typically whipping, without any trial or judicial oversight. If they suspected someone was a fugitive, they could capture and return them to their enslaver for reward money, essentially functioning as bounty hunters pursuing human prey. A typical documented case from 1720 Virginia involved an enslaved man named Caesar who escaped from a plantation near Williamsburg, seeking to reach Pennsylvania, where some Quaker communities offered refuge. His enslaver posted a reward of £5 and a description of Caesar. A slave patrol in the backcountry, routinely checking travelers, stopped a black man matching Caesar's description. Unable to produce a pass, he was detained, identified as the fugitive, and returned to his enslaver. Caesar was punished severely as a deterrent to other enslaved people considering escape, a fate that might include brutal whipping, branding, or even mutilation such as cutting off toes to prevent future escape attempts. Slave patrols represent the most organized, systematic law enforcement in the colonial period, predating any police forces by over a century. Some historians argue that these patrols were the true precursors to modern American policing, particularly in the South. They were formally organized, legally authorized, regularly scheduled, and had defined territories and procedures. But their purpose was not fighting crime in any legitimate sense. It was maintaining a system of racial oppression and terrorizing an entire population to prevent resistance to enslavement. This dark history is essential to understanding colonial crime fighting because it reveals how law enforcement is never politically neutral. The same colony that relied on voluntary posses to pursue actual criminals also created systematic patrols to capture people whose only crime was seeking freedom. This legacy would echo through centuries of American history, from antebellum slave catchers to Jim Crow-era police to modern debates about racial profiling and police violence. Social impact and analysis. The colonial system of criminal apprehension, posse comitatus, bounty hunting, slave patrols, and community vigilance shaped American society in profound and often contradictory ways that echo into the present. First, it created an enduring American tradition of armed self-reliance and direct community action. The expectation that ordinary citizens would drop their plows, grab their muskets, and pursue criminals fostered a cultural identity built around individual and community capability rather than dependence on government authority. This wasn't abstract philosophy. It was weekly reality in many communities. This tradition fed directly into militia culture, frontier vigilantism, and eventually into modern debates about gun rights and self-defense. The Second Amendment's reference to a well-regulated militia makes sense only in the context of this colonial expectation that citizens would serve as both community defenders and law enforcers. Second, the system was profoundly democratic in some ways but dangerously mob-driven in others. Because law enforcement relied on community participation, it was responsive to community values and concerns. If colonists thought certain crimes were serious threats, they mobilized aggressively to address them. But this same democratic character meant justice reflected community prejudices and passions. Religious minorities, the poor, strangers, and especially people of color, received far harsher treatment than well-connected colonists. The posse that might carefully apprehend a wealthy merchant's son could transform into a lynch mob pursuing a stranger accused of theft. The absence of professional standards and oversight meant outcomes varied wildly based on who you were and where you lived. Third, the bounty system created powerful economic incentives that could corrupt justice. When significant money was offered for capturing criminals, especially pirates with large bounties, the pursuit of justice became entangled with pursuit of profit. This created pressure to capture someone, anyone, who could plausibly match a description, regardless of actual guilt. It also meant wealthy victims could mobilize extensive private resources to pursue those who wronged them, while poor victims had little recourse. Justice became, in part, a commodity that money could buy. The slave patrol system represents the darkest legacy of colonial law enforcement, creating formal structures of racial control that would persist through centuries. The legal framework that gave white patrols authority to stop, search, and punish black people on suspicion alone established precedents that survived slavery's abolition. Post-Civil War black codes, Jim Crow laws, and modern controversies over racial profiling all trace lineage back to colonial slave patrols. The idea that certain populations deserved heightened surveillance and control based on race became embedded in American law enforcement culture. The absence of professional investigation meant colonial crime solving relied heavily on community knowledge, witness testimony, and sometimes superstition. This created strong incentives for communities to monitor each other closely. Everyone was a potential witness, informant, or suspect. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else, this social surveillance was effective at preventing and solving crimes. But it also created oppressive conformity where deviance from community norms could bring intense scrutiny. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Finally, the swift, public nature of colonial punishment, hangings, whippings, brandings performed before crowds, created a culture of spectacle around justice. Punishment wasn't just about deterrence. It was theater designed to demonstrate community values and power. This public, performative character of justice would gradually disappear as punishment moved behind prison walls, but its psychological impact on colonial communities was profound, creating a climate where fear of public shame and pain reinforced legal rules perhaps more effectively than any police force could. Modern connections, reflection. The colonial system of criminal apprehension might seem like ancient history, yet its echoes resound powerfully through contemporary American debates about law enforcement, criminal justice, and community safety. Consider modern citizens' arrest laws, which exist in virtually every American state. These laws directly descend from the colonial posse comitatus doctrine, the principle that ordinary citizens have legal authority to detain people they witness committing crimes. The 2020 murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia sparked intense debate about these laws when his killers claimed they were performing a citizen's arrest. The case revealed how colonial-era legal concepts persist into the present, sometimes with tragic consequences. Many states have since reformed or repealed citizens' arrest laws, recognizing that what made sense in 1700s communities without professional police creates dangerous vigilantism in the 21st century. The bounty hunter profession survives directly from colonial precedents, particularly in the bail bonds industry. Modern bail enforcement agents, bounty hunters, operate under legal frameworks not radically different from their colonial predecessors. They pursue fugitives for profit, have extraordinary legal powers. In many states, they can enter private property without warrants and cross state lines without extradition, and occupy a strange gray area between law enforcement and private business. The same ethical questions colonial Americans debated about mixing profit with justice remain unresolved. Should capturing criminals be a profit-driven activity? What happens when financial incentives override concerns about accuracy and justice? Community policing initiatives and neighborhood watch programs represent modern attempts to recapture the positive aspects of colonial community involvement in safety, local knowledge, shared responsibility, rapid response, while avoiding the mob justice dangers. When police departments encourage residents to be eyes and ears for officers, they're essentially reviving the hue and cry system. But as the Trayvon Martin case demonstrated, even supervised neighborhood watch can devolve into vigilantism when participants take law enforcement into their own hands rather than simply observing and reporting. The colonial slave patrol legacy casts the longest and darkest shadow. Modern conversations about racial profiling, stop-and-frisk policies, and police violence against Black Americans connect directly to law enforcement structures designed not to fight crime, but to control Black bodies. When critics argue that American policing has always been about enforcing racial hierarchies, they're referencing this history. The colonial precedent that certain populations deserved heightened surveillance and control formalized in slave patrols, established patterns that survived slavery's abolition, evolved through Jim Crow, and persist in data showing vastly disproportionate police stops, searches, and uses of force against people of color. The defund the police movement, whatever its merits, asks fundamentally colonial questions. Do we need professional police, or can communities handle public safety through alternative means? Could we return to more community-based, less militarized approaches to safety? Proponents often don't realize they're essentially asking whether aspects of the colonial system, community accountability, local control, non-carceral responses, might work better than professional police departments. Opponents counter that we tried community-based law enforcement already, and it led to exactly the mob justice, discrimination, and chaos that professional policing was designed to solve. Modern forensic science, DNA analysis, fingerprinting, digital surveillance, has transformed criminal apprehension in ways colonial Americans couldn't imagine. Yet the fundamental tension remains. How do we balance effective crime fighting with individual rights? How do we ensure justice serves everyone equally? How do we hold law enforcers accountable? Colonial Americans struggled with these questions when catching criminals meant forming posses and offering bounties. We're still struggling with them today, just with different tools. Perhaps most importantly, the colonial experience reminds us that law enforcement systems aren't eternal or inevitable. They're human inventions that can be reimagined. Colonial Americans built their system from necessity, experimenting with approaches that sometimes worked and sometimes failed spectacularly. As we grapple with modern policing crises, we might learn from both their successes and their failures. Colonial America's system of criminal apprehension was neither the romantic adventure of brave citizens pursuing justice, nor the simple chaos of mob rule. It was something far more complex and human, a pragmatic response to the reality that frontier societies couldn't afford or support professional law enforcement. What emerged was a patchwork of legal doctrines and social practices that sometimes delivered real justice and sometimes enabled terrible injustices. The posse comitatus system demonstrated that communities could mobilize effectively to pursue criminals, that ordinary citizens could take responsibility for collective safety, and that justice didn't require a vast bureaucratic apparatus. Men like Colonel William Rhett, who pursued pirates at great personal risk, proved that determination and community commitment could address serious threats even without professional police. But the colonial system also revealed the dangers of privatized, community-based enforcement. Bounty hunting mixed justice with profit in ways that corrupted both. Slave patrols showed how law enforcement could be weaponized to oppress entire populations. The absence of professional standards meant justice varied wildly based on who you were, where you lived, and whether the community liked you. Swift punishment, while decisive, was often irreversible when mistakes were made. The transition from colonial community enforcement to professional policing wasn't simply progress, it was a trade-off. We gained expertise, standardization, rights protections, and oversight mechanisms. We lost some community connection, democratic accountability, and the sense that public safety was everyone's responsibility rather than a service purchased from professionals. Understanding this trade-off helps us have more sophisticated conversations about modern police reform than simplistic calls to either eliminate police or grant them unlimited authority. The fundamental questions remain unchanged across centuries. How do we keep communities safe while respecting individual rights? How do we balance effectiveness with fairness? How do we ensure law enforcement serves justice rather than power? How do we prevent the protectors from becoming oppressors? Colonial Americans grappled with these questions using posses, bounties, and community watches. We grapple with them using professional police, oversight boards, and body cameras. The tools change, but the challenges endure. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from colonial crime fighting is humility. Our ancestors weren't fools operating in chaos. They built reasonably functional systems under difficult constraints. But they also made terrible mistakes, particularly in using law enforcement to maintain racial oppression. We've built better systems in many ways, but we've also created new problems. The challenge isn't choosing between colonial methods and modern policing, but rather learning from both to build something better than either. What do you think? Did colonial Americans have aspects of criminal apprehension right that we've lost? Or do their methods prove why professional, accountable police forces are essential? How should we balance community involvement with professional expertise? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into colonial justice, subscribe for more fascinating explorations of American history and the lessons it holds for our present. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical investigation into the people and systems that shaped America. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got to where we are today.